Mississippi, 1857. Behind a stable on a cotton plantation, a young man named Silas died under the lash. They buried him in an unmarked grave. But that same evening, something appeared on the barn wall, a shadow, moving, repeating the final moments of agony. And for 20 years, that shadow refused to die. If you want to know how this story ends, hit that subscribe button right now. This tale has been deliberately erased from records, hidden by those who want it to forget. Your subscription helps us bring buried truths into the light. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Chapter 1: The Last Strike. My name is Anna Blackwood. What I'm about to tell you happened on my family's plantation in Mississippi, in a time when human beings were treated as property. This is the story of Silas and the shadow he left behind. I was 5 years old when the shadow first appeared, too young to understand what I was seeing, too young to know the horror that created it, but I remember. Silas was 21 years old, young, strong, quiet. He worked in the fields from dawn until darkness swallowed the cotton rows. He never caused trouble, never raised his voice, never gave anyone reason to notice him, until that Wednesday morning in March. My father, William Blackwood, owned 300 acres of prime Mississippi soil, owned 87 human beings who worked that soil. He was known throughout the county as a fair master. That's what people called him, fair. What a grotesque word, fair. As if there could be fairness in owning another person's life. My mother, Catherine, was standing on the front porch that morning. Silas was walking past the main house, carrying water buckets toward the fields. He looked up, just for a moment. His eyes met my mother's. That's all it took. My father saw it from the study window, saw a slave look at his wife. And in that look, he imagined disrespect, imagined desire. Imagined a threat to the carefully constructed order that allowed him to sleep at night despite owning human souls. Father came out of the house like a storm. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't allow explanation. He grabbed Silas by the collar and dragged him toward the barn. The other workers stopped, frozen. They knew what was coming. They'd seen it before. Not often, but enough times to recognize the particular rage in my father's movements. The overseer brought the whip, leather, 9 feet long, braided, designed to tear flesh. They tied Silas to a post in the barn, stripped his shirt away. My father took the whip himself. He wouldn't delegate this. This was personal. This was about power, about maintaining the terror that kept the system functioning. The first strike cut across Silas's back like fire given physical form. He gasped but didn't scream. The second strike crossed the first. Blood began to flow. The third strike made him cry out. The fourth, the fifth, the 10th. My father fourth, the fifth, the 10th. My father didn't stop. The overseer tried to intervene after the 20th strike, said it was enough, said Silas had learned his lesson. But my father pushed him away. His face was red, sweat poured down his cheeks. His breathing came in ragged bursts. He was enjoying it. That's what the workers later whispered, that William Blackwood enjoyed the feeling of the whip in his hand, enjoyed the power of deciding whether another human being lived or died. Strike 30. Silas stopped screaming. His body went limp against the ropes. Strike 40. Blood pooled on the barn floor. Strike 50. Silas died. Not immediately, not cleanly. He hung there for 17 minutes after the beating stopped, his breathing shallow, his body broken beyond repair. My father stood watching, waiting, making sure everyone saw, making sure everyone understood The cost of looking where you weren't supposed to look. When Silas finally stopped breathing, my father wiped the blood from the whip handle and walked back to the house. He ate dinner that evening, drank wine, laughed at something my mother said, as if he hadn't just murdered the man for the crime of existing. They buried Silas that night behind the stable. No marker, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that a human being had lived and died. Just a hole in the ground, a body wrapped in burlap, dirt piled on top. The workers who dug the grave stood silent. They couldn't mourn openly, couldn't show grief. Grief was resistance. Resistance meant punishment. But they remembered. They would always remember. If this story is reaching you, if you feel the weight of these words, hit that like button. Subscribe so you never miss the truths that others try to bury. Your engagement keeps these forgotten voices alive. That night, as the sun set behind the cotton fields, something happened that no one could explain. A shadow materialized on the barn wall, the exact barn where Silas had died. At first, people thought it was just the evening light playing tricks. Shadows are common at dusk, nothing unusual. But this shadow was different. It moved. Not randomly, not like wind-blown branches or passing clouds. It repeated movements, specific movements. The shadow showed a figure with arms stretched upward, bound, straining against ropes, his body arching as if struck, again and again and again. The shadow was showing Silas's final moments. Old Thomas, who worked in the stables, was the first to see it clearly. He stood frozen, watching the shadow repeat its terrible dance. Watched it for 11 minutes straight. Then he went to the slave quarters and told everyone what he'd witnessed. By the time full darkness fell, 15 people had gathered near the barn, watching, silent. The shadow continued, over and over, the same movements, the same agony, as if Silas's final moments had been burned into reality itself. Someone suggested telling the master, but they all knew how that would end. William Blackwood didn't believe in ghosts, didn't believe in anything except his own authority, so they kept silent. They watched the shadow every evening, and they understood that Silas had left something behind, something that couldn't be buried, couldn't be forgotten, a witness to what had been done. My father never went near the barn after dark. He claimed he was too busy with plantation business, but the workers knew better. They saw how he avoided even looking in that direction, saw how his hands shook when someone mentioned needing supplies from the barn. He'd seen the shadow too. He just refused to admit it. My mother noticed, asked him if something was wrong. He snapped at her, said nothing was wrong, said she should focus on household matters and leave the running of the plantation to him. But at night, he drank more than usual, and he stared out the window toward the barn, watching, afraid. 3 weeks after Silas's death, my father ordered the barn wall painted over. Thick white paint, 3 coats, enough to cover anything. The workers painted during the day. My father supervised personally, made sure they covered every inch of wood. That evening, as the sun set, the shadow appeared again, on top of the fresh paint, darker than before, clearer, more defined. My father stood staring at it. His face went pale. He turned and walked back to the house without saying a word. The next day, he ordered the barn torn down, complete demolition, every board removed, every nail pulled. The wood was hauled away and burned in a massive fire that lit up the night sky. The workers built a new structure 50 feet away, new lumber, new foundation, nothing connected to the old barn. My father seemed satisfied. He'd destroyed the location. Surely, he thought, the shadow would disappear with it. That evening, the shadow manifested on the new barn wall. Same movements, same agony. As if distance and destruction meant nothing. Silas's final moments existed now independent of any physical location. They simply were. That's when my father stopped sleeping. Chapter 2: The Silent Witness. 5 months had elapsed since Silas died. The shadow appeared every evening without fail. The workers had grown accustomed to it. They no longer gathered to watch. It had become part of the landscape, a constant reminder. But something was changing. The shadow was no longer content to stay confined to the barn wall. My mother was the first to see it inside the house. She woke at 3 in the morning. Moonlight streamed through the bedroom window. She turned her head and saw it. A shadow on the wall beside the bed. A human form with arms raised high, body arching, suffering. She screamed. My father woke instantly, grabbed the lamp, held it up. The shadow didn't disappear in the light. It shouldn't have been possible. Shadows flee from light. That's their nature. But this shadow remained, dark against the illuminated wall, defying every natural law. My father's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the lamp. The shadow repeated its movements 11 times, then faded. My mother couldn't return to sleep. She sat in the parlor until dawn, all the lamps burning, every candle lit. She told my father she'd imagined it, a nightmare, nothing more. But neither of them believed that. The next night, the shadow emerged on the ceiling above their bed. The night after that, on the wall of the dining room during dinner. The night after that, on the white tablecloth between them. It was following them. Or rather, it was following my father. My mother begged him to do something, consult a priest, bring in someone who understood these things. But my father refused. He was a rational man, educated. He'd studied at university. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses or supernatural vengeance. Except he'd seen it. Every night. And he couldn't explain it away. He started drinking earlier in the day. Whiskey with breakfast, more whiskey before lunch. By evening, he was stumbling through the house, trying to drown the memory of what he'd done. But the shadow couldn't be drowned. The workers noticed the change in him. William Blackwood, who'd always been so certain, so commanding, now moved through the plantation like a haunted man. He jumped at sudden noises, avoided dark corners, kept every lamp in the house burning from dusk until dawn. The cost of lamp oil tripled that year. Old Thomas, who'd witnessed everything, told the others what he believed. Silas ain't gone. He's here, watching, waiting. He knows what was done, and he won't rest until it's answered for. Some of the workers found comfort in that idea. The thought that injustice didn't simply disappear, that there might be some kind of reckoning. Others were frightened. If Silas's shadow remained, what about all the others who died on this plantation? What about the dozens buried in unmarked graves throughout the county? What if they all came back? That's when I first became aware of the shadow. Children see things adults try to ignore. I was playing in the garden behind the main house, drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick. My mother was nearby, reading on the porch. The sun was beginning to set. Long shadows stretched across the lawn. And among those shadows, I saw one that didn't match any object, a figure with raised arms. I stopped playing, tilted my head, studied it. The shadow moved, not like the others. It repeated the same gesture, over and over. I walked toward it. My mother called out, "Anna, come away from there." But I was fascinated. The shadow looked sad. That's what I thought. It looks like it's crying. I reached out to touch it. The shadow shifted, moved away from my hand, but didn't disappear. It stayed just beyond my reach. "Anna?" My mother's voice was sharp now, frightened. I turned back to her. "What is it, Mama?" She came down from the porch quickly, too quickly, grabbed my hand and pulled me away from the shadow. "It's nothing, just the evening light. Come inside." But I could see her face. She was terrified. That night, I heard my parents arguing in their room. My mother's voice carried through the walls. "She's too young to see these things. We have to do something." My father's response was quieter, but I caught fragments. "Nothing to be done. It's not real. She's imagining things like you are." Then my mother said something that made the house go silent. "I see it every night now, William. On the walls, on the ceiling, on our bed linens. It's everywhere. And it's not going away until you face what you did." I didn't understand what they meant then, but I would. The shadow began appearing in my room. Not every night at first, just occasionally. I'd wake and see it on the wall opposite my bed, the silhouette with arms reaching skyward, moving through his final agony. I wasn't afraid. Children accept impossible things more easily than adults. The shadow was simply there, like the furniture, like the moonlight. I started talking to it. "I know you're sad," I would whisper. "I'm sorry you're sad." The shadow never responded, never acknowledged me, just continued its endless repetition. But I felt that it heard me. One evening, I was drawing in the dirt again. My mother was inside the house. I was alone in the garden. I drew a person, simple stick figure, arms raised, like the shadow. And I wrote words beneath it that I'd heard the workers saying. His name was Silas. When my father found the drawing later, his face went white. He demanded to know where I'd heard that name. I told him I didn't remember. Maybe the workers had said it. Maybe I dreamed it. He erased the drawing, told me never to draw such things again, never to speak that name. But it was too late. I knew the shadow had a name. And names have power. Chapter 3. Growing Darkness. 3 years passed. I was 8 years old. The shadow had become part of my life. I saw it daily, sometimes on walls, sometimes on the ground, sometimes on my mother's face when she thought no one was watching. My father had aged terribly. He was only 41 but looked 60. His hair had gone completely grey. Deep lines carved his face. He rarely smiled anymore. The plantation was falling apart. Not physically. The fields still produced cotton. The workers still labored from dawn to dusk. But something essential had broken. My father couldn't manage properly. He'd forget to check on harvests, forget to arrange sales, forget meetings with buyers. He was too busy watching for shadows. My mother had stopped sleeping in their bedroom. She'd moved to a guest room on the opposite side of the house. She told visitors she needed more rest. But everyone knew she was fleeing the shadow that appeared nightly on their bedroom walls. She'd grown thin. Her hands trembled constantly. She jumped at every unexpected sound. The workers whispered that the house was cursed, that William Blackwood had brought something dark into his home, and it was consuming his family from within. They weren't wrong. I began to understand more as I grew older. I listened to conversations I wasn't supposed to hear, pieced together fragments of the truth. A man named Silas had died. My father had caused that death, and now something remained, something that wouldn't let anyone forget. I started asking questions. Old Thomas was the one who finally told me the whole story. He was 73 years old. He'd lived on this plantation his entire life, had seen more horrors than he could count. But Silas's death had affected him deeply. He told me how it happened. The look that wasn't really a look, the rage that wasn't really justified, the beating that went far beyond punishment into pure murder. He told me how they'd buried Silas behind the stable, how no one had been allowed to mourn, how the shadow had appeared that very evening. "Your father killed a man for nothing," Thomas said, "and that nothing has become everything. It follows him, follows her whole family, won't let go until the debt is paid." "What debt?" I asked. Thomas regarded me with sad, tired eyes. "The debt of acknowledgement. Someone has to admit what was done. Admit it was wrong. Admit that Silas was a person who mattered, who deserved to live. Until that happens, his shadow will remain. I went to my father that evening, found him in his study, drinking as usual. "Papa," I said, "tell me about Silas." His hand froze halfway to his mouth, the glass trembled, whiskey sloshed over the rim. "Where did you hear that name?" "The workers' talk, everyone knows." He set the glass down carefully. His bloodshot eyes met mine. "It was an accident, a discipline that went too far. These things happen." He was lying. I could see it in his face. "You killed him," I said. My father's face contorted. Anger, shame, fear, all mixed together. "He was a slave. He forgot his place. I had to maintain order. You don't understand how things work." "I understand that a man died." My father stood abruptly, chair scraping back. "You know nothing. You're a child. When you're older, you'll understand the necessities of maintaining a plantation, of keeping control." I looked at him, really looked, saw what he'd become. A broken man haunted by his own actions, too proud to admit fault, too frightened to face the truth. "The shadow appears every night," I said quietly, "doesn't it?" He didn't answer, just stared at me, and I saw fear in his eyes. "It will never stop," I continued, "not until you admit what you did." "Get out," he whispered. "Papa, get out." I left the study, heard him pour another drink, heard him muttering to himself in the darkness. That night, the shadow appeared in my room more clearly than ever before. I sat up in bed and watched it. The figure with arms extended upward, body arching, suffering without end. "I'm sorry," I whispered to it. "I'm sorry for what he did to you." The shadow didn't respond, but for just a moment it seemed to pause, as if it had heard, as if my words meant something. Then it continued its repetition. I began drawing the shadow, obsessively, on paper, in dirt, on the walls of my room when my mother wasn't watching. My mother found my drawings and screamed, demanded to know why I was drawing such horrible things. "Because it's real," I told her. "Because pretending it doesn't exist won't make it go away." She slapped me. It was the only time she ever struck me. Her hand left a red mark on my cheek. She immediately burst into tears, apologized over and over, held me while she sobbed. "I can't live like this anymore," she whispered, "seeing it everywhere, every night, on every surface. I close my eyes and I see it behind my eyelids. I'm going insane." "Then tell Papa to confess," I said. "Tell him to admit what he did." She pulled away from me. Her hollow eyes stared into mine. "He'll never do that. Never. It would destroy him, destroy our family's reputation, destroy everything." "It's already destroyed," I said. And I was right. Chapter 4. The Child Who Knew. I was 10 years old when I started talking to the shadow regularly. My parents thought I was developing a mental illness. They consulted doctors, men in dark suits who asked me strange questions, examined my eyes, checked my pulse, declared me physically healthy, but perhaps too imaginative. They recommended less time alone, more structured activities, perhaps a governess to keep me occupied. But they didn't understand. Before we go deeper into what happened next, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Stories like this one are rarely told. Your support ensures more hidden histories come to light. Drop a comment with your thoughts so far. I wasn't imagining anything. The shadow was real, and it had things to say. Not in words, shadows don't speak, but in movements, in the way it appeared. In where it chose to manifest. It was communicating. I began to understand its language. When my father lied about plantation business, the shadow materialized in his study, darker, more insistent. When my mother pretended everything was fine, the shadow emerged on her dressing mirror. When guests visited and my parents acted as if nothing was wrong, The shadow manifested in the dining room. Right there during dinner, between the candles, on the white tablecloth. Most guests couldn't see it, or chose not to, but a few noticed, saw something wrong with the light, with the way darkness seemed to pool in impossible places. Those guests never returned. Our social circle shrank. The Blackwood family became known as peculiar, isolated. People avoided us at church, stopped inviting us to gatherings. My father blamed it on jealousy, on petty county politics. But I knew the truth. The shadow was driving everyone away. One afternoon, I was in the garden again, drawing in the dirt. I drew a man, drew chains around his wrists, drew tears on his face, and I wrote beneath it, "He wants us to cry the way he cried." My mother found me there, saw the drawing, went pale. "Anna, where did you get that idea?" I looked up at her. The shadow told me. She grabbed my shoulders, shook me gently. "Shadows can't tell you anything. They are just absence of light, nothing more." "This one is different," I said. "This one remembers." My mother released me, stepped back, and for the first time, I saw her truly look at me, not as her daughter, but as someone who understood something she couldn't bear to face. "What does it want?" she whispered. I tilted my head, considered the question. "Recognition," I said finally. "It wants us to see him, really see him, not as property, not as a slave, as a person who lived, who felt, who died in agony. It wants us to acknowledge that his death mattered." My mother sat down in the dirt beside me, her expensive dress dragging in the dust. "Your father will never do that. Then the shadow will never leave." We sat together in silence, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the garden. Among them, one shadow that didn't match any object. A figure with arms lifted toward the sky, forever frozen in his final moments. That evening, something changed. My father came to dinner drunk, more drunk than usual. He could barely stand, had to lean on the doorframe for support. My mother tried to help him to his chair. He pushed her away. "I see it," he muttered, "all the time now, even during the day, even with my eyes closed. It won't stop, won't leave me alone." "William, please," my mother began. He slammed his fist on the table. Dishes rattled. "I did what I had to do." That slave looked at my wife, looked at her with lust in his eyes. I had to punish that, had to maintain order. I was small for my age, but in that moment, I felt ancient. "He looked at her the way any person looks at another person," I said quietly. "You killed him for being human." My father's face turned purple. "What did you say?" "You killed him for existing, for reminding you that he was a person just like you. That's why the shadow won't leave, because you refuse to admit what you really did." My father lunged toward me. My mother screamed, stepped between us. "She's a child, she doesn't understand." But I did understand, maybe better than either of them. My father collapsed into his chair, began weeping, great horrible sobs that shook his whole body. "I can't make it stop," he gasped. "God help me, I can't make it stop." The shadow formed on the wall behind him, darker than I'd ever seen it. So dark it seemed to absorb light. A void in the shape of a man. "Then admit what you did," I said. "Say his name. Acknowledge him." "I can't." My father's voice was broken. "If I admit it, then I have to face everything else. Every other person I've owned. Every family I've separated. Every punishment I've given. Every time I treated a human being like property. If I admit that Silas mattered, then I have to admit that all of them mattered. And I can't carry that weight. It'll kill me. It's already killing you, my mother whispered. And she was right. My father was dying. Not from illness, from guilt, from the slow erosion of his soul under the weight of what he'd done. The shadow watched us, silent, waiting, always waiting. Chapter 5. The Weight of Years. I was 15 years old. 10 years had passed since Silas died. My father rarely left his room anymore. He'd aged into an old man, though he was only 46. His hands shook constantly. He couldn't hold a pen steady enough to sign documents, couldn't manage the plantation. My mother had taken over. She ran everything, made decisions, dealt with buyers, managed the workers. She'd grown hard, efficient, emotionless. I think she'd killed something inside herself to survive. The shadow still appeared, every night, but we'd all learned to live with it. Like living with a chronic illness, you adapt, find ways to function around the pain. But I couldn't adapt. I saw the shadow and remembered what it represented. A man named Silas, 22 years old, who died for nothing. I began researching, reading old records, talking to the older workers who remembered. They told me about Silas, not just about his death, about his life. He'd been kind, quiet, loved singing, had a beautiful voice that he used in the fields to help pass the time, made the work bearable for others. He'd been teaching himself to read, scraps of newspaper, old books he'd found. He'd hidden this knowledge. Reading was forbidden. But he dreamed of freedom, dreamed of the North, dreamed of a life beyond the plantation. He'd been in love, a woman named Grace. She'd worked in the house. They'd planned to run away together, find the Underground Railroad, escape to Canada. But Grace had been sold 2 weeks before Silas died. Sold to a plantation 300 miles away. They'd been separated deliberately. My father had discovered their attachment and ended it the only way he knew how, by destroying it. Silas had been heartbroken, that's what Thomas told me. He had lost the will to fight, lost the will to hide his emotions. That's why he'd looked up that morning, not with lust, not with disrespect, with grief, pure, terrible grief. And my father had killed him for it. I told my mother what I'd learned. She listened with that hard, distant expression she'd developed. "What do you want me to do with that information?" she asked. "I want us to acknowledge it, to admit that we destroyed a person's life, multiple lives. Silas and Grace and everyone else we've hurt." My mother looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "We can't change the past. What's done is done. But we can change how we respond to it." She turned away. End of conversation. I went to my father's room. He was sitting by the window, staring out at nothing. The shadow was on the wall beside him, always beside him now. "Papa," I said, "I know about Grace." He didn't react, didn't acknowledge me. "I know Silas loved her. I know you separated them. I know that's why he looked up that morning, because his heart was broken." My father's voice came out thin, brittle. "Stop. No. You need to hear this. You killed a man who was grieving, who'd lost the person he loved. You saw emotion in his face and decided he deserved death for it. Stop. Say his name. Admit what you did. Ask for forgiveness. I said stop." He tried to stand, collapsed back into his chair, too weak, too broken. The shadow grew darker, expanded, filled half the wall. I realized something in that moment. The shadow was feeding on his guilt, growing stronger as he grew weaker, drawing power from his refusal to acknowledge the truth. "What if it never stops?" I asked quietly. "What if you die and it remains? What if it follows our family forever?" My father finally looked at me. His eyes were hollow. "Then you'll carry what I couldn't. And maybe you'll be stronger than I was." He turned back to the window, dismissed me without words. I left his room knowing that he would never confess, never admit fault, would die with this weight still chained to his soul. And the shadow would remain. The plantation was failing. Everyone could see it. Cotton prices were dropping. Workers were less productive. My father's inability to manage had created chaos that my mother couldn't fully repair. People talked about selling, moving somewhere else, starting over. But the shadow would follow. I knew that with complete certainty. This wasn't about location. It was about truth, about acknowledgement, about looking directly at what had been done and naming it for what it was: murder. That year, 3 workers died from preventable illnesses. My mother couldn't afford medical care. The plantation was nearly bankrupt. More workers were sold to cover debts. Families separated, children taken from mothers, husbands from wives, the cycle continuing. I watched it happen, powerless, still a child in their eyes, without authority, without voice. But I was learning about the system that allowed this horror, learning about the laws that defined human beings as property, learning about the economic structures that made slavery profitable, learning about the moral compromises people made to justify participating in atrocity. And I was learning that the shadow represented something larger than one man's death. It represented every crime of slavery, every stolen life, every destroyed family, every person treated as less than human. Silas's shadow was a witness to all of it, and it would not be silent. That evening, I went to his grave, the unmarked spot behind the old stable. Grass had grown over it. Nothing distinguished it from the surrounding ground except my memory of where it was. I sat beside the grave, spoke to the earth. "I know you're still here, Silas. I know you're waiting. I don't know how to give you what you need. I don't know how to make my father acknowledge what he did, but I promise you this." I paused, felt the weight of what I was about to say. "I will remember you. I will tell your story. I will make sure your life mattered, even if my father won't, even if my mother won't. I will." The shadow took form on the grass beside me, closer than it had ever been. For the first time, it didn't repeat its agony. It simply stood, arms at its sides, still, peaceful, just for a moment. Then it resumed its eternal repetition. But I'd seen the possibility of peace, and I understood what it would take. Not my father's confession. He was too broken for that. It would take mine. I would have to stand at this grave and acknowledge the full truth, not just about Silas, about all of it, the entire system, my family's participation in it, the wealth built on suffering, the comfort purchased with other people's lives. I would have to face what my father couldn't, and I would when I was ready, when I was strong enough to carry the weight he'd refused. The shadow waited, and so did I. Chapter 6: Search for Truth. I was 20 years old. My father had died 3 months earlier. Heart failure, the doctor said, but I knew better. His heart had failed long before it stopped beating. They buried him in the family cemetery on the hill overlooking the plantation. Granite headstone, his full name carved in elegant letters, dates of birth and death, a quote about being a respected landowner All lies made permanent in stone. My mother attended the funeral in black silk, dry eyed. She hadn't loved him for years. Maybe she'd never loved him. Maybe she'd only loved the security he provided, the status, the comfortable life built on other people's suffering. She died 2 weeks after him. Not from illness. She simply stopped. Stopped eating. Stopped speaking. Stopped acknowledging the world. The doctor called it melancholia. I called it surrender. She'd fought so hard to maintain normalcy, to pretend everything was fine, to run the plantation despite its moral rot. And when my father died, she had no reason to keep fighting. The shadow had won. Except it hadn't, because the shadow was still here, still appearing every evening, still repeating its eternal agony, still waiting for acknowledgement that never came. Now it followed only me. I inherited everything: the plantation, the house, the debts, and 83 human beings who looked at me with a mixture of hope and suspicion. 4 had died over the years: disease, overwork, the cruelties of the system. What would the daughter do that the father hadn't? Would I be different? Could I be different? I spent the first week after my mother's funeral going through documents, records, ledgers, the detailed accounting of human beings bought and sold like cattle. Names, ages, prices paid, skills listed. Each entry was a person, a life reduced to inventory. I found Silas's record. Purchased 1853 from an estate sale in Tennessee. Age 17. Paid $800. Listed as healthy, obedient, suitable for field work. $800 for a human life. The notation ended with his death. Deceased March 1857. No cause listed. No investigation. Just a line through his name. Erased, but not forgotten. I showed the record to Thomas. He was 80 years old now, could barely walk, but his mind remained sharp. He looked at the page with sad recognition. That's all he was to them, a number in a book. Tell me everything, I said. Everything you remember about him. Thomas settled into a chair, closed his eyes, and began to speak. Silas came here at 17, scared, alone. He'd been separated from his mother at that estate sale, never saw her again, didn't know if she was alive or dead. He cried every night for the first month. We could hear him in the quarters, trying to muffle the sound so the overseer wouldn't hear. But grief doesn't stay quiet. Eventually he adapted, learned to survive, made friends, started singing while he worked, had the most beautiful voice you ever heard, could make the saddest song sound like hope. Thomas paused, opened his eyes. He fell in love with Grace. She worked in the big house, your mother's personal servant. They'd meet in secret behind the smokehouse after dark, planning their escape. They were going to run, had it all figured out. There was a conductor on the Underground Railroad about 40 miles north. They just needed the right moment. But your father found out. Don't know how. Maybe someone told him. Maybe he just noticed the way they looked at each other. He sold Grace the next week. Didn't tell Silas until she was already gone. Just announced it at morning assembly. Grace has been sold. No goodbyes, no final meeting. Silas tried to run after the wagon. The overseer got him, beat him, chained him in the barn overnight. When they let him out the next morning, something had broken in him. You could see it in his eyes. The hope was gone. That's when he started making mistakes. Missing work, moving too slow, not responding quickly enough when called. He wanted to die. I think part of him was already dead. Grace took that part with her. 2 weeks after she left, he looked up at your mother. And your father saw it, saw a broken man daring to look at a white woman, saw disrespect where there was only grief, and he killed him for it. Thomas's voice broke. Even after all these years, the memory wounded him. We buried him that night. No ceremony, no words. Just put him in the ground like trash. But the shadow came that same evening, and we knew that Silas wasn't really gone, knew he was still here, still witnessing, still waiting. I listened to all of it, let the truth settle into my bones. My father had destroyed 2 lives that day, Silas and Grace, had torn apart their love, their hope, their future. All because he needed to maintain control, needed to prove his power. And for 20 years, Silas's shadow had been asking one simple question. Did I matter? Was my life worth anything? Does anyone remember me as a person? Where is Grace now? I asked Thomas. He shook his head. Don't know. Soul too far away. Could be anywhere. Could be dead. Most likely we'll never know. I need to find out. Thomas gazed at me with ancient eyes. Why? Because Silas deserves to know what happened to the person he loved. Because their story shouldn't end with separation and silence. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. You're not like your father. No, I'm not. But could I undo what he'd done? Could I repair 20 years of harm? I didn't know, but I had to try. I spent the next month searching records, writing letters, contacting auction houses, tracking sales. Grace had been sold to a plantation in Alabama, then sold again 2 years later to someone in Georgia, then again to South Carolina. Each sale meant another separation, another trauma, another life disrupted. I finally traced her to a plantation outside Charleston, wrote a letter to the owner, asked if Grace was still there, if she was alive. 3 weeks later, I received a reply. Grace had died in 1860, childbirth. She was 24 years old. The baby had died too. I sat with that letter for hours, feeling the weight of it. Silas had died in 1857, Grace in 1860. 3 years apart, 300 miles apart, never knowing what happened to the other, never getting closure, never getting goodbye. All because my father had decided their love was inconvenient. I took the letter to Silas's grave. The unmarked spot behind the stable was overgrown now. Wild grass and weeds had reclaimed it. You couldn't tell anyone was buried there unless you knew where to look. I cleared the growth away, sat on the bare earth. The shadow appeared immediately, darker than ever, as if it had been waiting for this moment. I have news, I said to the shadow, to Silas, to whatever remained of him. Grace is dead. She died 3 years after you, in Charleston. She never forgot you. The owner's letter said she spoke your name even at the end. The shadow didn't change its movement, continued its repetition, but I felt something shift, a pressure in the air, an attention focused on me. I'm sorry, I continued. I'm sorry my father destroyed your love, destroyed your lives. I'm sorry you died without knowing what happened to her. And I'm sorry she died without knowing what happened to you. I paused, felt tears on my face. You mattered, Silas. Your life mattered. Your love mattered. Grace mattered. And what was done to both of you was evil, pure evil. And I acknowledge that. I see it. I name it. The shadow slowed, just slightly. I don't know if that's enough, I whispered. I don't know what you need from me, but I promise you this. I will not let you be forgotten. I will not let your story disappear. I will not pretend it didn't happen. The shadow stopped, completely stopped. For the first time in 20 years, it stood motionless, arms still raised, but no longer moving, no longer repeating its agony, just standing, present, acknowledged. Then it faded, not disappeared, but softened, became less solid, less insistent. It was still there, but different, changed. I remained at the grave until darkness fell completely. Then I went back to the house and made a decision. I was going to free everyone. Chapter 7. The Weight of Freedom. The morning after I spoke to Silas's shadow, I gathered everyone who lived on the plantation, all 83 people who I technically owned, who'd been born into or sold into bondage, who'd known nothing but this life of forced labor. They assembled in front of the main house, uncertain, frightened, young and old, parents and children, people who'd lived here their entire lives and people who'd been here only months. I stood on the porch. My hands were shaking. "I have an announcement," I said. My voice barely carried. Thomas was in the front. He nodded at me, encouraging. I cleared my throat, tried again, louder this time. "I'm freeing you, all of you, effective immediately. You're no longer slaves. You're free people." Silence. Complete, absolute silence. They stared at me, not understanding, not believing. I continued. "I'm dividing the land. Each family will receive 40 acres. You can farm it yourselves, keep the profits, build homes, live as free people." Still silence. Then an older woman in the back started crying. Deep, wrenching sobs. Others joined her, crying, laughing. Some fell to their knees. Some embraced each other. Thomas walked up to the porch, tears streaming down his face. He gazed at me. "You mean it? This isn't a trick?" "I mean it. I'm having legal documents drawn up, full emancipation, legal ownership of land parcels, everything documented properly." He took my hand, squeezed it. "Silas would have liked you." Those words broke something in me. I started crying too. The next months were chaos. Good chaos, hopeful chaos. I had lawyers draw up emancipation papers for everyone, had the land surveyed and divided, gave each family their deed. Some chose to stay and farm their new land. Others left immediately, headed north, seeking family members they'd been separated from years ago, chasing freedom beyond Mississippi's borders. I gave them money for travel, what little remained. The plantation was nearly bankrupt, but I sold furniture, paintings, silver, everything I could convert to cash. My mother's jewelry bought passage north for 17 people. My father's collection of books bought supplies for those who stayed. The house slowly emptied, became an echo of itself. And through it all, the shadow remained, softer, less insistent, but still present, still waiting for something more. Thomas stayed. He was too old to travel, too tired to start over somewhere new. We sat together one evening in the empty parlor. "You did a good thing," he said. "It's not enough," he nodded. "Nothing will ever be enough. The harm done can't be undone. The years stolen can't be returned. The dead can't come back. But it's something. Is it? The shadow is still here." Thomas looked toward the wall where the shadow had appeared. It wasn't visible in the lamplight, but we both knew it would return at dusk. Maybe the shadow isn't waiting for the others to be freed. They weren't killed. They're alive. They can build new lives. Silas can't. His life was taken, his future erased. Freeing others doesn't resurrect him. Then what does he want? Thomas was quiet for several moments. He wants to be mourned, really mourned, not as a slave, as a person. Someone has to grieve for him the way they'd grieve for any human being whose life was stolen. I thought about that, about the difference between acknowledgement and grief. I'd acknowledged what happened, spoken the truth, named the crime, but I hadn't grieved, couldn't grieve for someone I'd never known, couldn't feel the loss personally. But maybe that was the point. Maybe that was what the shadow had been trying to teach my family all along. You don't have to know someone personally to recognize that their death matters, to feel the wrongness of it, to let it wound you. That night, I went to Silas's grave again. The shadow was already there, waiting. I sat on the ground and I let myself feel it, all of it. The horror of his death, the injustice of it, the waste of potential, the love destroyed, the future stolen. I thought about him at 17, arriving here scared and alone, missing his mother. I thought about him learning to sing, finding joy despite everything. I thought about him falling in love with Grace, planning escape, daring to hope. I thought about that hope being crushed, Grace being sold, his heart breaking. I thought about that final morning, looking up with grief in his eyes,
and being beaten to death for it.
and I cried. Not polite tears, not controlled sadness. I sobbed, loud and ugly and real. I grieved for Silas, for Grace, for their destroyed love, for every moment they'd been denied, every future they'd never see. I grieved for the injustice of a system that allowed human beings to be treated this way, that made their suffering legal, profitable, normal. I grieved until I had no tears left. And when I finally stopped, when I looked up, the shadow had changed again. It was kneeling. For the first time in 20 years, it wasn't standing with raised arms, wasn't frozen in agony. It was kneeling, head bowed, as if in prayer, or rest, or peace. Silas, I whispered, I see you. I remember you. Your life mattered. Your death was wrong. And I grieve for you. The shadow began to fade, slowly, gradually, like morning mist dissolving in sunlight. But as it faded, something remained. An outline on the ground, pressed into the earth itself. The perfect silhouette of a human body, kneeling, permanent. I reached out to touch it. The grass wouldn't grow there. The earth had been marked, changed at some fundamental level. This spot would remain different forever. A permanent witness. A reminder. The shadow itself was gone. 20 years of haunting had ended. But the mark remained. And I understood. Silas's presence was no longer needed. He could rest now, could join Grace wherever the dead go. But the mark would ensure he wasn't forgotten, would ensure that anyone who came here would see that something had happened in this place, something that mattered, something that couldn't be erased. I stayed at the grave until dawn, watching the outline, memorizing its shape. This was my inheritance. Not land, not wealth, but this mark, this reminder, this responsibility to remember. Thomas found me there in the morning. He looked at the outline, nodded slowly. It's done then? Yes. Good. He deserved peace. We both did.
Chapter 8. Building Memory.
3 months had passed since the shadow disappeared, since the mark appeared on Silas's grave. The plantation was unrecognizable. Where there had been fields worked by enslaved people, there were now small farms owned by free families, houses being built, gardens planted, children playing without fear. Where there had been the overseer's cabin, there was now a school. I'd hired a teacher from the north, a woman who'd been teaching freed people to read for years. 23 children attended, learning letters, learning numbers, learning that they could shape their own futures. Thomas taught there sometimes, shared stories, made sure the children understood where they'd come from, what had been overcome. The main house stood mostly empty. I'd kept only a few rooms for myself. The rest I'd opened as a meeting hall, a place where people could gather, discuss farming, plan for the future, vote on community decisions. It was messy, chaotic, beautiful. But I couldn't stop thinking about the mark on Silas's grave. It remained unchanged. Grass wouldn't grow there. Rain didn't wash it away. The earth held the shape of that kneeling figure as if it had been burned in at the molecular level. I showed it to everyone who visited, told them Silas's story, made sure they knew what had happened here. But it wasn't enough. A story told orally dies when the last person who remembers it dies. And I wouldn't live forever. None of us would. The mark would remain. But without context, future people might not understand what it meant, might see it as a curiosity, an oddity, nothing more. I needed something permanent. I needed a monument. I consulted with Thomas and others who'd known Silas, asked them what would be appropriate, what would honor him properly. We debated for weeks. Some wanted a statue, others wanted a written memorial. Some wanted to leave it as it was, let the mark speak for itself. Finally, we reached consensus. We would place a stone. Simple, honest, with words that told the truth. I hired a mason from Natchez, a man who specialized in grave markers. I showed him the outline on the ground, told him what I wanted. He listened, looked at the mark for quite a while. I have carved stones for 40 years, he said. Never seen anything like this. The earth itself remembering. That's powerful. What should the stone say? I asked. The truth, his name, his age, how he died. Let the future judge us. We designed it together, a granite stone, waist high, simple design. Words carved deep so time wouldn't erase them. The stone was installed on a Wednesday morning, the same day of the week Silas had died. Everyone gathered. The people who'd stayed, the children from the school, some who'd left but returned for this moment. We stood in silence as the mason positioned the stone at the head of the outline, making sure it was level, making sure it would last. Then he stepped back, revealed the words. Silas, 21 years old, died March 18th, 57, beaten to death for the crime of being human. Remembered. Simple, honest, true. Some people cried, others stood silent, bearing witness. Thomas spoke first. His voice wavered but held strong. Silas was my friend. He was kind. He loved grace. He dreamed of freedom. And he was murdered for daring to feel human emotions. This stone marks his grave, but more than that, it marks a promise that we will not forget, that we will not let history be rewritten, that we will tell the truth about what happened here. Others shared memories, stories, fragments of Silas's life that they'd carried all these years. He sang while he worked, made everyone feel less alone. He shared his food when others were hungry. He stood up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. He was brave. Even when they beat him, he was brave. Each story added layers, transformed Silas from a name on a stone into a full person. Complex, real, missed. When everyone had spoken who wanted to speak, I stepped forward. I never knew Silas. I was born after he died. But his shadow followed my family for 20 years, a witness to injustice, a reminder of what my father did, what our whole society permitted. I can't bring Silas back, can't undo his death, can't restore what was taken from him. But I can do this. I can remember him, honor him, make sure his story is told. I paused, looked at all the faces around me. This monument isn't just for Silas, it's for all of them. Everyone who died in slavery, everyone who was treated as property, everyone whose names we don't know, whose graves are unmarked, whose stories were deliberately erased. This stone says, "You mattered. Your lives mattered. Your deaths mattered. And we remember." We stood together in silence. Let the weight of it settle. Then the children from the school came forward, one by one, and placed flowers on the grave. Wildflowers picked from the fields. Simple, beautiful. A offering, a recognition. That evening, I walked through the former plantation, saw the new houses going up, heard laughter, saw families together. It wasn't perfect. Freedom didn't erase trauma, didn't automatically heal generations of harm. But it was different. And in that difference, there was hope. I returned to Silas's grave at dusk, the time when his shadow used to appear. The stone stood solid in the fading light. The outline remained on the ground, unchanged, unchangeable. The shadow didn't appear, didn't need to anymore. Its work was done. Truth had been spoken. Justice had been acknowledged. Memory had been preserved. And Silas could rest. Wherever the dead go, he was there now. No longer bound to this place by the need to witness, to remind, to haunt. He was free. Finally, truly free. Chapter 9. Generations Forward. 5 years had passed since Silas's stone was placed. I was 25 years old. The community around the former plantation had grown, thrived. What had been fields of cotton forced by enslaved labor were now diverse farms. Vegetables, fruits, grains, each family growing what suited their land, what interested them, what fed their own children. The school had expanded, 47 students now, learning, growing, planning futures their parents had never been allowed to dream of. Thomas had died 2 years earlier, peacefully, in his sleep, at 83 years old. Before he died, he'd taken me aside, held my hand with his weathered fingers. "You did what your father couldn't. You chose truth over comfort, memory over forgetting. That takes courage." I'd cried when he died, grieved genuinely, not because I'd owned him, but because I'd known him, as a person, as a friend, as someone who'd taught me more about honor than my own family ever had. We'd buried him in the new cemetery, the one we'd established for the community, with a proper stone, his full name, his dates, and the words, "He remembered." Silas's grave had become a pilgrimage site of sorts. People came from other counties, other states, freed people who'd heard the story, who wanted to see the mark, the stone, the proof that one person's life had been acknowledged. They'd stand there, read the words, touch the stone, look at the outline that still wouldn't grow grass, and they'd understand something profound. That memory matters, that truth matters, that refusing to forget is an act of resistance against those who want to erase uncomfortable history. I'd started writing everything down, Silas's story, my father's crime, the shadow, the 20 years of haunting, the mark that remained. Not for publication, not yet. Mississippi wasn't ready to face these truths. The war was coming, everyone could feel it. The tension between North and South over slavery itself. But someday, when enough time had passed, when people could bear to look at what had been done, I wanted the record to exist. I wanted future generations to know exactly what happened here.
One autumn evening, a woman arrived at the property. Middle-aged, well-dressed. She asked to see Silas's grave. I walked her there. She stood looking at the stone for many minutes, silent. Then she knelt, placed her hand on the outline, and began to cry. "Are you all right?" I asked. She looked up at me. Her eyes were amber, unusual, beautiful. "I knew Silas," she said. "Years ago. We were children together, before he was sold south." I felt my heart race. "What was your name?" She smiled sadly. "Does it matter? I'm just one of thousands, millions. We all have stories like his. We've all lost people to this evil system. But you came here, to his grave." She stood, brushed dirt from her dress. "I come to all of them. Every grave I can find, every memorial, every marker. I bear witness. I remember. It's all I can do." She looked at me intently. "You did well, placing this stone, preserving his memory. But remember this. Silas represents all of them. Every person whose grave is unmarked, whose name is forgotten, whose story was erased. This stone holds space for all of them." I nodded, understanding. The woman turned to leave, paused. "The shadow is gone," she said, "but the mark remains. That's how it should be. Peace for the dead, responsibility for the living." She walked away into the gathering dusk. I never saw her again, but her words stayed with me. Peace for the dead, responsibility for the living. That's what the mark meant, what it would always mean. Silas had found peace. The shadow had released its hold. But we who remained carried the responsibility to remember, to tell the truth, to make sure such evil never became acceptable again, to make sure that every person's life, every person's death, mattered. I stood at the grave as darkness fell. The stone was solid, permanent, the outline undisturbed. And I made a promise. I would maintain this place, would make sure the stone stayed readable, would tell Silas's story to anyone who would listen. Would pass that responsibility to whoever came after me. This wouldn't be forgotten, not in my lifetime, not ever. Chapter 10. The Mark That Remains. 55 years had passed since Silas died. I was 60 years old. The war had come and gone. The Confederacy had fallen. Slavery had been abolished. The world had changed in ways my younger self could barely have imagined. The community around the former plantation had evolved. Some families had moved away, seeking opportunities in cities, in the north, in the west. Others had stayed, built lives, established roots. The school still operated, now teaching a third generation, children whose grandparents had been enslaved, who'd been born into freedom, who knew slavery only as history.
I'd published my account of Silas, of my father's crime, of the shadow that haunted our family. Some dismissed it as fiction, as impossible. Shadows don't behave that way. The dead don't haunt the living. But others understood, recognized the truth beneath the supernatural elements. That guilt haunts. That crimes against humanity don't simply disappear. That what we do echoes through generations. Silas's grave had become something more than a personal memorial. It had become a symbol. People made pilgrimages from across the South, freed people and abolitionists, scholars and activists, people who wanted to understand, who wanted to remember. They'd read the stone, study the mark on the ground, and understand that they were standing at a place where truth had refused to die. The mark remained unchanged. 55 years of weather, 55 years of seasons, 55 years of time passing, and the outline of that kneeling figure stayed perfectly preserved. Scientists had come to study it, tried to understand how the earth itself held this shape, how grass refused to grow there, how rain didn't erode it. They had theories, unusual mineral deposits, chemical changes in the soil, compacted earth from the original events. But none of their theories fully explained it, because some things exist beyond scientific explanation. Some things are simply true in ways that don't fit neat categories. I came to the grave every week, an old woman now, moving slowly, needing a cane. But I still came, still placed flowers, still told Silas's story to visitors, still maintained the stone. It had become my life's work, my purpose. One spring morning, a young girl arrived with her grandmother. The grandmother was in her 70s, had been born into slavery, had gained freedom as a teenager when the war ended. She stood at the grave, holding her granddaughter's hand. "This is why we remember," she told the child. "This is why we tell the stories, so that what happened to people like Silas never happens again." The girl looked at the stone, at the mark on the ground. "Why won't the grass grow there?" she asked. "Because the earth remembers," her grandmother said. "When something important happens, when a truth needs to be preserved, sometimes the world itself holds on to it." The girl knelt, touched the outline carefully. What was his name again? Silas. He was 21 years old. He loved someone named Grace. He died for being human. The girl traced the outline with her finger. "I'll remember him." "Good. That's all we can do. Remember. And make sure others remember too." They left flowers, stood in silence for a moment, then walked away hand in hand. I watched them go, felt tears on my face. This is what Silas's shadow had wanted, what it had waited 20 years for. Not vengeance, not punishment, just memory, just acknowledgement that his life had mattered, that his death had been wrong, that he deserved to be remembered as fully human. And now, generations later, a child who'd never known slavery stood at his grave and promised to remember. The work continued. That evening, I sat on the ground beside the stone, my old bones protesting, but I needed to be close. "Thank you," I whispered to Silas, to his memory, to whatever remained of him. "Thank you for not letting us forget, for refusing to disappear, for haunting my family until we faced the truth. It was a gift, even though it didn't feel like it at the time. You gave us the chance to change, to choose truth over comfort, memory over erasure. Not everyone takes that chance. My father didn't. My mother didn't. But I did. And because I did, this community exists. These children learn. These families thrive. Your death wasn't meaningless. As much as I wish it had never happened, as much as I grieve for the life you were denied, Your story changed things, changed me, changed everyone who hears it and understands. The sun set, darkness fell, stars emerged, and on the ground, the mark remained. That outline of a kneeling figure, peaceful, at rest, a shadow that had finally found peace, but left behind a permanent reminder, a mark that said, I was here, I lived, I loved, I died, and I matter. A mark that said, remember. A mark that said, never again. A mark that would last as long as the earth itself. And maybe longer, because some truths, once spoken, can never be unspoken. Some memories, once preserved, can never be erased. Some marks, once made, can never be removed. I stayed at the grave until the moon rose, an old woman keeping company with the memory of a young man who died decades before, connected across time by the simple act of remembering, by refusing to forget, by choosing truth. The mark remained and would remain forever.